Welcome to week 5 of the Music of the Beatles here on Coursera. This week we're going to talk about 1968, and for the most part, 1968 in the career of the Beatles is encompassed with the recording of the album, often called the White Album, but officially just called The Beatles. Anyway, a double album with a lot of songs for us to get through this week. And then at the end of our videos this week, we'll talk a little bit about the project Yellow Submarine. I'm not giving it full consideration, as much consideration as we've given some of the other records, because in many ways it's not even really a Beatles project, but almost like kind of the Beatles licensing their images for the purposes of this movie. But we'll get to that when we get to the last video of this week. For now, I'd like to start out by giving you an overview of some of the main points that we'll hit on, and some of the main points I'll be coming back to again and again during the course of this week. One of the things we can see in 1968 is the Beatles remain friends, despite some kinds of growing tensions in the group that we already talked about last week when they made the transformation from being a live band to being a studio band. It meant that people's roles in the group were kind of shifted. John and Paul became more the main movers and shakers in what was going on, and George and Ringo not exactly reduced to being sidemen, but it was not the same kind of relationship the four had been in when they were doing live shows all the time, even though recording had been part of that. Now recording really was the only thing. But they remain friends, and you can see that already in them taking the trip to India, which we'll talk about in just a minute, going together, not taking separate vacations. Now, even though they were still together as a group, when we get to the White Album, we'll see that they worked less like a band together and more like a kind of songwriters co-op in which each of the members played on the other one's songs, or didn't in some cases. And so it's less like a group that has one single identity as a sort of four guys sort of pulling together as the Beatles, then kind of like Paul McCartney and the Beatles, John Lennon and the Beatles, George Harrison and the Beatles. And so now this line we've been following all the way through to kind of keep the John songs and the Paul songs and the George songs separate. Now we can see how that can be useful, because we really are going to be talking almost like we're talking about three albums, an album by Paul, an album by John, and maybe sort of an EP or something by George, and even one song by Ringo on this album. Another thing that happens in 1968 is the Beatles attempt to take control of their business affairs, launching a company called Apple Corps, C-O-R-P-S, of course the pun, Apple Corps, right? But nevertheless, they're trying to take control of the business part of their activities, because, as we talked about in the last video, Brian Epstein passed away in August of 1967. They'd already been planning to do something like Apple when Brian passed away, but now it was really imperative that they try to get the business part of it together. So we'll talk a little bit in just a second about how all that went. So let's run through some of the big events of 1968 just to kind of sketch the year out before we actually get into the White Album and the songs that are on it. At the very end of 1967, in December, the group opened the Apple Boutique in London. And the initial idea behind the Apple Boutique was to have a shop where they could have not only clothes, but also books and records and things that they really kind of endorsed in terms of what we would today think of as a kind of a lifestyle kind of a shop. Remember now, this was very early days before the idea. I mean, there was already a psychedelic shop, for example, in San Francisco, but there weren't really a lot of shops that really sort of catered to kind of what was becoming the counterculture or hippie worldview. Some of the records and some of the music they sold there was music that we would now think of as world music, and the Beatles were in many ways some of the first ones to really bring an appreciation for music of other cultures to their fans, and in the case of, especially in the case of Indian music, but also books that reinforce their worldview. And so the Apple Boutique opens as a kind of a Beatle business enterprise in December of 1967. Unfortunately, it doesn't go particularly well. I mean, I think they ended up thinking that the shop was was fine, but they really kind of dabbled at it and it didn't work out, and by the summer, July of '68, it was closed. You got to hand it to the Beatles. They closed the shop in style, rather than just closing the store or remaindering all the inventory, you know, going out of business sale or something like that. They just decided they were going to close it, and they set up a day where anybody who wanted to could come in and take one item free. In other words, they gave everything in the store away, and that really constitutes, according to Paul McCartney, the bulk of the loss that the store racked up. Of course, they had a special private session the night before they had the public one, and people who were close to the group or knew the group got to come and take whatever they wanted from the store. And then what was left over, they opened up to the general public. So, but already that we can see the sort of first step toward taking care of their business. February through April of 1968, they take a trip to Rishikesh. The four of them together. Ringo stays just a couple of weeks. Paul stays a little bit longer than that. John and George stay the full time to study. They went to Rishikesh to study in India, to study with the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, to study transcendental meditation at his ashram there. There were other famous people there with them. Donovan, I believe, was there. Mike Love of the Beach Boys was there as well. Mia Farrow and her sister Prudence were there, giving rise to the song Dear Prudence. We'll talk about that when we talk about the White Album. So it was a whole cohort of young 20-something people, young, beautiful people, all going to this, what essentially was a kind of a meditation camp with the Maharishi in India, and staying there longer certainly than they had the experience in Bangor in the summer, the late summer of 1967, studying transcendental meditation. The trip to Rishikesh ended up with a misunderstanding with the Maharishi. It was at the time, it was that John Lennon thought that he found out that the Maharishi was making passes at some of the young women that were with him. And he found this incredibly hypocritical of somebody who was talking about, you know, living a life free from, you know, earthly desires and trying to reach a kind of a spiritual level, and then, you know, heading out after the women. Yeah, this didn't seem right. And in John's mind, it was just another person who was trying to rip the Beatles off, to take advantage of their fame, to advance their own personal agenda, this kind of thing. Well, it later turns out that this people who were there, more information came out over the years, and it turned out that none of this really happened that way at all. There was some troublemaking going on inside the members that were there, and stories were made up and this kind of thing. And most of the Beatles who commented on it later ended up saying that they thought the Maharishi was really a fantastic guy, and they were glad they had an experience with him. But nevertheless, the song Sexy Sadie comes out of John's anger over the way things ended. So anyway, they left the ashram there in Rishikesh kind of feeling like they'd made a mistake, or some things hadn't worked out quite the way they wanted them to. We get in March the release of the single Lady Madonna, with the Inner Light on the B side of that. In May, the Beatles officially launch Apple Corps, and they go to the United States and have a big press conference. They appear on The Tonight Show talking about it, announcing that they've started their own company, their own record label, their own production company, this kind of thing. You know, in years following, lots of bands would have their own record labels and do their own production and various kinds of things like that. The Beatles were kind of the first in, and so they were laying the groundwork for maybe a kind of a change that would happen in the business in the years to come. Well, in May, after the Beatles get back, after John and Paul get back from the U.S., the White Album sessions begin in earnest, and the album, they work on the album from May through October. At the end of the summer, in August, Hey Jude is released as a single with Revolution as its B-side. In November, the White Album is released, and then in early January, the animated feature Yellow Submarine is also released. The album and the film are released. And so we'll talk about Yellow Submarine at the very end of this week's lectures, although it's, strictly speaking, is, you know, just outside of 1968. Nevertheless, having looked over sort of done a quick survey of the Beatles in 1968, we can kind of see the main events of what was happening with the group in that year. Let's take a minute now to kind of look at the songs that were on the singles that were released. Remembering now that Magical Mystery Tour had been a flop at the end of December when the film was broadcast. It was panned by critics. The U.S. Network that had the rights to broadcast in America canceled the show, and so that part of it was a flop. Now the album itself was really quite successful in the music that went with it, but there was a sense in the Beatles camp that maybe they needed a hit, you know, to really kind of make sure that people didn't get the idea that the Beatles were on the way out. And so we get Lady Madonna from Paul, recorded in February of 1968 and released in March. It went to number 4 in the US, number 1 in the UK, and even the fact that it went to number 4, most groups would kill for a number 4 hit. Even the fact that it went to number 4 was seen as, oh, the Beatles are losing it. Their single only went to was only a top 5 single. What could possibly be wrong with the group, right? And so even that didn't satisfy a lot of folks. Now we'll come back to this song in one of our close-ups when we look at some of the Paul songs and talk about Lady Madonna in more detail and how it fits into Paul's what seems to be his new tendency at this time to really look back into his own past and into previous rock and roll and pop music styles to sort of find a new way forward, but I don't want to anticipate my story too much. The B-side of Lady Madonna, The Inner Light, a George song, another one we'll talk about in one of the song close-ups a little bit later. This one recorded in India in '68, so just before Lady Madonna, and then finished during some of the same sessions that produced Lady Madonna. The B-side continues in George's Indian music style, and we'll talk about that when we talk about it in more detail. And 2 other songs that we'll talk about in detail a little bit later. Paul's Hey Jude, which was the big hit that proved to everybody that the Beatles were not out of it, recorded in July of 1968 and released in August. This song went to number 1 in the U.S. and the U.K., and we'll talk a little bit more about the lyrics, the song form, and some of what makes that song so special. With the B-side of it being Revolution, imagine another sort of A-B kind of thing, and that song went to number 12, so you had the A-side going to number 1, the B-side going to number 12. The Beatles were definitely back, and any rumors to the effect of their death were greatly exaggerated and certainly premature. So this gives us a sense of what was happening with the singles over the year 1968. I want to say a word before we go on about the Beatles as idealists. One of the things that we can see as we watch the Beatles' career unfold is that even in the times when they're failing trying to do something that is very idealistic. So if they fail, perhaps it's because they were naive or their expectations were too great or something like that. I think we can see that with regard to their relationship to drugs, especially to psychedelic drugs, not so much pot, which I think they use more recreationally than anything else. But with regard to LSD and other drugs, the idea of sort of exploring some kind of higher awareness, the turning to the Maharishi and transcendental meditation, making the commitment to take a couple of months and go to India to sort of get closer to the source, that kind of thing, it's all a very idealistic kind of approach. The idea that they could start a company and help other musicians with that company, as they tried to do with Apple Corps. You know, there was even an ad at one point that they put in the paper that said, you know, send us your tapes, send us your projects, and, you know, we'll help you produce them. You won't have to go to the big, you know, corporate types, you know, the money grubbers, this kind of thing. The Beatles would try to help. This was naive but incredibly idealistic, and so you can see that sort of consistently. What you don't see a lot of is them scheming to kind of maximize their product or really sort of thinking the way sort of in the caricature of the sort of greedy business model. They really seemed, where they made mistakes, they made them out of naivete and out of unbounded idealism. And I think this attitude really hooks into the way they approach their music during this period. That is, the emphasis on the artist approach, you know, and the emphasis on authenticity, being real, trying to do something that's real, that has some real substance to it, that's really trying to achieve something in the music, and not doing anything cheap or quick or in a kind of a second-rate kind of manner, a fast kind of manner, just which a group like the Beatles could have done, considering their celebrity. People would have bought almost anything at a certain point. And so I think the combination of the Beatles' idealism with their sense of authenticity, they're projecting an image of authenticity, and casting themselves as working as artists in a really earnest and kind of sincere way, became a very important model to many who would follow them. In the period following this, a lot of people looked at the White Album as that album, you know, that may have had certain flaws, and maybe all the tunes weren't as sort of consistently good, but it was the one where the Beatles were really sort of authentically there, at least for a lot of artists coming later. So that's maybe part of the big impact of 1968 is the real nailing down of what it means to be a sort of a responsible artist in the popular music community. And again, what a big transformation that is from what they stood for in 1963 and 1964, which was just really, you know, charismatic performers and talented pop songwriters and musicians. Well, having talked about that, let's move on to our actual discussion of the Beatles' White Album.